Some crimes have no statute of limitations, and some dead people are too stubborn to stay in their graves. The house of Daryl and Shawnee Kincaid was aglow with lights on a warm May evening. The two-story building in a respectable suburb of Birmingham was decorated with garlands, and laughter and music drifted from the open windows. Guests arrived one after another, leaving their expensive cars along the wide driveway. It was an anniversary. 10 years since Imani Kincaid, Daryl's first wife, had disappeared in the mountains during their honeymoon. Officially, the evening was modestly billed as a gathering of friends, a commemorative dinner. But those who knew Daryl and Shawnee closely understood that for the couple, it was more of a milestone, a mark of time that marked the beginning of their real life. Daryl stood at the bar in the living room, pouring whiskey for his old friend Tyrone Ellerby. Daryl had put on weight in recent years. A comfortable life, expensive restaurants, and a lack of remorse had done their job. At 42, he looked like a successful, satisfied man. His pharmacies brought in a steady income, his house was full of nice things, and his wife was beautiful and intelligent. Tyrone, his friend since school, slapped him on the shoulder. 10 years, bro, he said, shaking his head. How time flies. I remember how broken you were back then, and now look at yourself. You were able to move on and build a new life. Daryl smiled, but something elusive flashed in his eyes. Yes, life goes on. Imani would have wanted that. Shawnee appeared beside him, elegant in a dark blue dress, a glass of white wine in her hand. She was 3 years younger than her husband, and her years of marriage to Daryl had transformed her from a simple pharmacy administrator into a confident, sophisticated woman. Tyrone, how are you? Is business going well? Not complaining, he replied, sipping his whiskey. Medical equipment is always in demand, but you're way ahead of me. 4 pharmacies is serious business. The conversation flowed on, light and superficial. Zola Mabry, Shawnee's friend, sat on the sofa with a plate of snacks and watched the hosts. Zola worked as a bank manager, and her sharp mind rarely missed a detail. She noticed how Shawnee nervously adjusted her hair, how Daryl refilled his glass too often. Something about this anniversary felt wrong, though Zola couldn't explain what. She remembered Imani, a quiet, kind girl who worked as a nurse and seemed completely unsuited to Daryl. And then she disappeared into the mountains, and 6 months later, Daryl was already dating Shawnee. Too fast, too convenient. The evening dragged on. The guests ate, drank, and danced. No one noticed the tension that hung in the air between the hosts. Only when the last guests left around midnight did Daryl and Shawnee remain alone in the large house, full of empty glasses and plates. Shawnee kicked off her shoes and sat down on the sofa, massaging her feet. I'm tired, she said, but it went well. Everyone was happy. Daryl nodded, pouring himself another whiskey. He had drunk more than he had planned, and his head was spinning slightly. Yeah, another year behind us. Shawnee looked at him for a long time. Stop drinking like that. You think too much. What do I have to think about? He snapped. Everything's fine. Everything's good. They went to bed late, exhausted and silent. The night was quiet, with only the wind rustling the leaves outside the window. The next morning began as usual. Shawnee woke up first, took a shower, and went down to the kitchen for coffee. Daryl was still asleep, snoring on the second floor. She went out onto the porch to get the newspaper from the mailbox by the road. The morning was crisp, the sun just rising above the horizon. Shawnee opened the box and saw the newspaper, several advertising flyers, and a small white envelope with no stamp or return address. She frowned, took the envelope, and went back into the house. In the kitchen, sipping her coffee, she opened the envelope. Inside was a photograph, old and slightly faded. Shawnee recognized it immediately. It was a picture of Daryl and Imani taken 10 years ago. In the photo, they were standing at the edge of a cliff, Imani smiling, her dark hair blowing in the wind. Daryl had his arm around her shoulders. Shawnee turned the photo over. On the back, in neat handwriting, was written, "Thank you for remembering me." Shawnee's hand trembled, and the coffee cup almost slipped from her other hand. She stared at the inscription, reading it over and over again. Who could have sent this? Why now? She quickly went upstairs and shook Daryl awake. Wake up, now. Daryl opened his eyes, frowning in annoyance. What's wrong? Shawnee handed him the photo. Daryl sat up, took the picture, and froze. His face turned pale. Where did this come from? From the mailbox. This morning. No stamp, no address. Daryl turned the photo over, read the inscription, and cursed. One of our friends decided to play a joke. A stupid joke. Which friends? Shawnee hissed. Which of our friends keeps old photos of Imani, and why would they write something like that? Daryl stood up and paced around the bedroom. I don't know. Maybe one of her relatives. Her mother died a few years ago, but she might have had cousins. She didn't have any close relatives, you know that. They stood there looking at each other, and a heavy silence hung in the room. Finally, Daryl threw the photo on the bed. Forget it. It doesn't mean anything. Just throw it away. But Shawnee didn't throw it away. She hid the photo in a drawer under her underwear and thought about it all day. Daryl went to one of his pharmacies, trying to distract himself with work, but his thoughts kept returning to the envelope from that morning. Who knew about Imani? Who could have gotten that photo? 3 days later, a second letter arrived. This time, Daryl found it when he came home from work. It was the same white envelope, with the same missing stamp. Inside was a newspaper clipping. A 10-year-old article about the disappearance of Imani Kincaid in the Alabama mountains. The headline read, "Young woman missing during honeymoon." Daryl read the text, feeling a chill spread through his body. The article was short, mentioning the fruitless search, the grieving husband, the lack of clues. There were no additional notes. Daryl called Shawnee. She came down the stairs, saw his face, and immediately understood. Another one? He silently handed her the clipping. Shawnee read it, her lips pressed together. Someone's playing with us. Obviously, Daryl sighed. But who? And why? Shawnee sat down on the sofa, clenching her hands into fists. Maybe someone knows something. Maybe someone saw us back then. Impossible. There was no one there. We checked. Then where did it come from? Daryl didn't answer. He poured himself a whiskey, drank it in one gulp, and poured another. Shawnee looked at him with concern. You're drinking too much. And you're worrying too much, he snapped. The third letter arrived 2 days later. Inside was a simple note, printed on a printer. See you soon. Nothing else. Daryl crumpled the paper and threw it in the trash can, but Shaughness took it out and smoothed it out. We can't ignore this. What do you suggest? Go to the police? And say what? That someone is sending us old photos? Shaughness didn't know how to respond. They both understood that going to the police was the last thing they could do. Too many questions. Too much attention. Daryl started drinking even more. In the evenings, he would sit in his office with a bottle, staring blankly out the window. Shawnee tried to stay calm, but anxiety gnawed at her insides. She checked the mailbox several times a day and flinched at every phone call. One evening, on his way back from the pharmacy in the city center, Daryl got stuck in traffic on 20th Street. He sat in his SUV, drumming his fingers on the steering wheel, when he happened to glance out the window. On the sidewalk, among the crowd of passers-by, stood a woman. She was thin, dressed in a simple dark jacket and jeans, but her face, Daryl would recognize that face anywhere. Imani. She stood motionless, staring straight at him through the car window. Her face was pale, emotionless. She didn't smile or gesture. She just stared. Daryl's heart skipped a beat. He blinked and rubbed his eyes. When he opened them again, the woman was still standing there. The cars behind him began to honk. The traffic jam had started moving. Daryl swerved sharply onto the sidewalk, turned on his hazard lights, and jumped out of the SUV. He ran to where the woman had been standing, pushing past pedestrians. But when he got there, no one was there. He turned his head, trying to spot her in the crowd, but she had disappeared. Daryl stood on the sidewalk, breathing heavily, until someone yelled at him that he was blocking the road. He returned to his car, started the engine, and drove home, gripping the steering wheel with his white knuckles. At home, he immediately poured himself a whiskey and drank it without sitting down. Shawnee came out of the kitchen, saw his condition, and frowned. "What's wrong?" Daryl put the glass on the table. "I saw her." "Who?" "Imani. On the street. She was standing there looking at me." Shawnee froze. "What?" "I saw her, Shawnee. With my own eyes. She was there." Shawnee came closer and grabbed his arm. "You're drunk. You're drinking too much and you're hallucinating." "It wasn't a hallucination," he shouted, pulling his arm away. "I saw her. Alive." Shawnee turned pale. She took a step back, wrapping her arms around herself. "That's impossible. She's dead. You checked her pulse yourself back then. She was dead." "Then who's sending these letters? Who was standing on the street?" Shaughness opened her mouth but couldn't find the words. They stood in the living room, looking at each other, and for the first time in 10 years, something they had never spoken about aloud hung between them. That night in the mountains, the gunshot, the body falling into the ravine. They had built their lives on that foundation, and now the foundation was beginning to crack. "Maybe we were wrong," Shaughness whispered. "Maybe she didn't die. Maybe she survived." Daryl shook his head. "No, impossible. She fell more than 20 meters into the ravine. Even if the bullet didn't kill her, the fall must have." "It should have," Shaughness repeated. "But what if it didn't?" They fell silent. Daryl reached for the bottle again, but Shaughness snatched it away from him. "Stop drinking. We need to think." "Think about what? If she's alive, we're done for." "Don't say that. We don't know for sure. Maybe it's someone else. Maybe someone found out the truth and is blackmailing us." "Then why no demands for money? Why only letters and visions?" Shaughness didn't answer. She sat down on the sofa, her head bowed. Daryl paced the room like a caged animal. Finally, he stopped. "I'm going crazy. It's just stress. The letters, the anniversary, it's all getting to me. I made her up on the street." Shawnee raised her head. Maybe you're right. We just need to calm down. Ignore the letters. Move on with our lives." But moving on was becoming increasingly difficult. They spent the next few days in tension, avoiding conversations about the letters and visions. Daryl tried to work but couldn't concentrate. Shawnee called Zola, trying to maintain the appearance of a normal life, but her voice sounded unnatural. That night came unexpectedly. They went to bed around 11, both exhausted and silent. Daryl took a sleeping pill to drown out his thoughts. Shania's tossed and turned for a long time before falling into a restless sleep. Around 3 in the morning, they were awakened by a noise. First it was voices, then the sound of cars. Daryl opened his eyes, disoriented. Shawnee was already sitting up in bed, listening. "What is it?" Daryl got up, went to the window, and looked out. Several cars with their headlights on were parked in front of their house. Neighbors were coming out of their houses and gathering at their fence. Someone was pointing at their house. "What's going on?" Shawnee asked, coming up to him. Daryl didn't answer. He quickly pulled on his jeans and t-shirt and ran downstairs. Shawnee followed him, throwing on her robe. They stepped out onto the porch and froze. On the white wall of their house, the one facing the street, one word was written in huge letters in red paint. "Murderer." The letters were uneven and smudged, but they were clearly legible even in the light of the street lamps. The neighbors stood and watched, some whispering, some just staring. Shanice grabbed the porch railing, feeling her legs buckle. Daryl stood motionless, staring at the writing, his face the color of chalk. Mrs. Chamberlain, the neighbor on the right, came closer. "Daryl, what does this mean? Some of the hooligans?" Daryl forced himself to turn to her. "I don't know. Probably. A stupid joke. Stupid." "We should call the police," said Mr. Grant, the neighbor on the left. "No," Daryl said quickly. "Don't. I'll take care of it. I'll paint over it tomorrow." The people exchanged glances, but gradually began to disperse. Shawnee and Daryl remained standing in front of their house, staring at the red writing. The paint was still wet, dripping down the wall, leaving bloody trails. Daryl slowly turned to his wife. It was her. Shanice nodded, unable to speak. They returned to the house, closed the door, and sat in the dark living room without turning on the lights. Outside the window, the voices gradually faded away and the cars drove off. But the writing on the wall remained, reminding them that the past had not been forgotten and that retribution was near. The morning greeted them with a gray dawn and heavy heads. Daryl had hardly slept, sitting in a chair in the living room and staring out the window. Shani was dozing on the sofa, curled up in a ball, but every rustle made her flinch. When the sun was high enough, Daryl went outside. The writing on the wall looked even more sinister in the daylight. The red paint had dried in uneven streaks, and the letters looked crooked and angry. Mrs. Chamberlain was looking out the window across the street, and Daryl waved to her, putting on a calm face that he didn't feel. He went back into the house, changed into his work clothes, and got some cans of white paint and a roller from the garage. Shanice joined him, silently picking up a brush. They worked for almost 2 hours, covering the writing with layer after layer. The paint didn't go on well, the red showing through the white, and they had to apply a 4th coat. When the job was done, the wall looked uneven, with fresh spots, but the word was no longer legible. "Some teenagers," Daryl said loudly so the neighbors could hear, "probably got the wrong house, or just hooliganism." Mr. Grant, who was walking by with his dog, nodded sympathetically. "Young people have become completely insolent. We need to install cameras." Daryl muttered something in agreement and hurried into the house. Inside, he leaned against the wall and closed his eyes. Shani was washing her hands in the kitchen, scrubbing the paint off her fingers. Her face was pale and haggard. "We have to do something," she said quietly. "What exactly?" Daryl walked over to her, lowering his voice. "Do you want to go to the police? Tell them that someone is after us for a murder we committed 10 years ago?" Shani shuddered at the word murder. They almost never said it out loud. "Then what?" Daryl looked out the window at the mountains in the distance. "I'll go there. I'll check it out." "Why?" "To be sure, to understand." The next day, telling Shani that he was going to the neighboring county on business, Daryl set off for the mountains. The drive took over an hour. He drove along a narrow highway winding between hills, past abandoned farms and scattered houses. The place where they had stopped that night 10 years ago was hard to reach, an old observation deck overgrown with bushes where tourists no longer came. Daryl turned onto a dirt road, the car shaking over the bumps. Finally, he stopped at a familiar turn. Getting out of the SUV, he looked around. The place looked even more neglected than before. The trees had grown wild, the grass was waist-high. Daryl pushed through the thicket until he saw the cliff. He approached the edge cautiously, holding onto branches. Below was a ravine, deep, dark, with sharp rocks at the bottom. Trees grew on the slopes, their roots clinging to the rocks. Daryl stood and looked down, remembering that night. It took him almost half an hour to find a relatively safe way down. He descended slowly, holding onto tree trunks, slipping on wet rocks. His clothes were torn by branches, his hands were scratched. When he finally reached the bottom of the ravine, he stopped, breathing heavily. It was damp and cold here, with almost no sunlight penetrating the tree canopy. Daryl began to search. He combed the area, looking under bushes and turning over rocks. No bones, no scraps of clothing, nothing. Only fallen leaves, moss, and silence. He sat down on a rock, wiping the sweat from his forehead. So either her body had been carried away by the stream that flowed here in the spring, or someone had found it, or she had left on her own. The thought chilled him to the bone. Daryl climbed back up with even greater difficulty, clinging to roots and branches. By the time he reached the car, the sun was already setting. He got behind the wheel, dirty and exhausted, and drove home, not knowing whether he felt better or, on the contrary, worse. When he returned in the evening, Daryl found Shanice in the kitchen. She was sitting at the table with a cup of cold tea, staring at a single point. "Well?" she asked without looking up. "Nothing. There's nothing there." She nodded as if she had expected it. "So she's alive," Daryl didn't answer. He went to the bathroom, washed off the dirt, and changed his clothes. When he returned to the kitchen, he wanted to say something, but froze. On the table, where only Shawnee's cup had been a few minutes ago, now lay a bracelet. A thin silver bracelet with a small heart-shaped pendant. Daryl recognized it instantly. It was a gift he had given Imani on their first date. "Where did this come from?" he croaked. Shawnee raised her head, saw the bracelet, and turned pale. "I didn't put it there. It wasn't there when I came into the kitchen." Daryl looked around. The door was locked, the windows were closed. He walked through the house, checking the rooms. In the living room, a picture hung slightly crooked. In the bedroom, the closet door was ajar, even though he remembered closing it that morning. Someone had been here. Someone had broken into the house while he was away and left the bracelet. "She was here," Shaughness whispered, wrapping her arms around herself. "She was in our house." Daryl picked up the bracelet and clenched it in his fist. The metal was cold. "We'll change the locks. We'll install an alarm system." "That won't help." Shaughness's voice trembled. "She'll find a way. She wants us to know she's here." That night, Daryl hardly slept a wink. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, his thoughts crawling like worms. He remembered that night 10 years ago. The memory came back with brutal clarity. The three of them were riding in his car. He was driving, Imani was next to him, and Shawnee was in the back seat. Imani was happy, smiling, talking about how beautiful the mountains were at sunset. Daryl suggested stopping at an old lookout point to take pictures. Imani agreed enthusiastically. They got out of the car, and Shawnee led Imani to the edge of the cliff, pointing to the valley below. Imani stood with her back to Daryl, admiring the view. Shawnee stepped aside. Daryl took the gun out of his jacket pocket, the same gun he had bought on the black market a month earlier. Imani turned at the click of the slide, and her smile faded. She looked at him in confusion. "Daryl?" she managed to say. He fired. The sound was deafening in the silence of the night. Imani clutched her chest, a moan escaping her lips. She swayed and fell. Daryl and Shawnee looked at each other. Shawnee nodded. They lifted the body, Imani was light, and threw it into the ravine. The body fell, breaking branches, and disappeared into the darkness. They stood at the edge, listening, but there was only silence below. Then they quickly returned to the car and drove away. The next day, Daryl reported to the police that his wife had disappeared while hiking in the mountains. He played the role of the grief-stricken husband perfectly. The search yielded nothing, and the case was closed as an accident. Daryl clenched his fists, pushing the memory away. He was sure she was dead. He thought he had checked her pulse, but now... The next few days passed in growing tension. Tyrone called Daryl and suggested they meet for lunch. Daryl couldn't refuse without arousing suspicion. They met at a restaurant in the city center. Tyrone was cheerful and talkative as always, but his eyes studied his friend intently. "You look like crap, bro," he said, taking a sip of beer. "What's wrong?" "Too much work," Daryl lied. "Problems with suppliers." "Why don't you take a vacation? Go somewhere with Shawnee. You haven't had a break in a long time." Daryl smiled stiffly. "Maybe." Tyrone paused, then leaned forward. "Listen, you can trust me. If something's wrong, tell me. I'm your friend." "Everything's fine," Daryl snapped. Tyrone backed off, but the suspicion in his eyes remained. Zola also noticed the changes in Shawnee. She called her friend and suggested they meet for coffee. Shawnee tried to refuse, but Zola insisted. They met at a small coffee shop on the outskirts of town. Zola ordered a latte, Shawnee ordered black coffee, which she didn't even touch. "You look terrible," Zola said bluntly. "What's going on?" "Nothing, just tired." Zola shook her head. "Don't lie to me. I've known you too long. Is it because of Daryl? Are you having problems?" Shawnee clenched her teeth. "No, everything's fine." Zola paused, then asked quietly, "Is it because of Imani?" Shawnee froze. "What?" "Imani. Your predecessor. It was the anniversary of her disappearance recently. Maybe that affected you? Shani licked her dry lips. Why are you asking about Imani? Zola shrugged. I just always thought there was something off about that story. A young woman disappears during her first week of her honeymoon, and there's no trace of her. And 6 months later, her husband was already with someone else. You were friends back then. Doesn't that seem strange to you? What are you implying? Shani's voice became sharp. Nothing. Just thinking out loud. Shani stood up and grabbed her bag. I have to go. Thanks for the coffee. She left without looking back. Zola watched her go with a pensive expression. The next day, Daryl saw Imani again. He was leaving his main pharmacy around 6 in the evening when he noticed her standing by her car. She was leaning against the car next to hers, looking at him. She was wearing dark glasses, but Daryl recognized her immediately. His heart began to race. He rushed toward her, but she quickly moved away from the car and stepped into the street. A taxi was passing by. She raised her hand, and the car stopped. Imani got in and slammed the door. Daryl ran after the taxi, shouting, but it was already driving away. He remembered the number, a yellow sedan with the number HKJ 567. That evening, he found the taxi company's phone number and called. He explained that he had forgotten his things in the car, gave the number and the approximate time. The dispatcher checked and said that the car had not been on a job at that time, but had been parked in the lot. The driver had not picked up anyone. That's impossible, said Daryl. I saw it with my own eyes. I'm sorry, sir, but our records say otherwise. Daryl hung up. Either the dispatcher was wrong, or Imani had paid the driver to lie, or it was all a figment of his fevered imagination. He no longer knew what to believe. In desperation, Daryl decided to visit his mother. Rashan lived in a small town an hour's drive from Birmingham. He arrived on Saturday afternoon. The old woman greeted him without much enthusiasm. She had always been reserved with her son, especially after the Imani incident. What can I do for you? She asked, showing him into the living room. Just decided to visit, Mom. Rashan sat down in her chair, folding her hands in her lap. She was wearing a strict black dress and a cross around her neck. How are you and Shani doing? Fine. Everything's fine. Rashan looked at him for a long time, studying him. You don't look well, son. You've lost weight. Something's bothering you. Daryl lowered his eyes. Just work. Don't lie to me. His mother's voice was quiet but firm. I know when my son is lying. It's because of that girl, isn't it? Because of Imani. Daryl flinched. What makes you think that? Rashan sighed. Sins always come back to haunt you, son, sooner or later. I've prayed all these years for that girl to find peace. But God doesn't always answer our prayers the way we want him to. Daryl stared at his mother. What are you trying to say? I don't know anything for sure, but I'm not blind. That girl disappeared too conveniently for you. The money she inherited went into your business, and a few months later you had a new wife. Too many coincidences. Daryl stood up. Are you accusing me? I'm no judge, son. But if you did something, it will come out sooner or later. The truth always comes out. Daryl left his mother's house, slamming the door behind him. He got into his car and sat there for a long time, gripping the steering wheel. Even his mother suspected him. The whole world seemed to know the truth. The night was cold and moonless. Daryl and Shani went to bed around 11, exhausted and silent. They lay side by side, not touching each other, each lost in their own thoughts. Daryl fell into a restless sleep around midnight. Shani's tossed and turned for another hour before falling asleep. The sound of breaking glass shattered the silence around 3 in the morning. Daryl jumped out of bed so abruptly that his head spun. Shania screamed. In the middle of the room, on the floor, among the shards of glass, lay a brick. The cold night air rushed in through the broken window. Then a scream came from the street, a piercing, furious female scream. You will pay for this, murderers! The voice was familiar, unforgettable. It was Imani's voice. Daryl and Shani rushed to the window, stepping on the shards with their bare feet. They looked outside. The street was empty. Not a soul in sight. Only the streetlights illuminated the sidewalk and parked cars. Silence. "She was here," Janice croaked. "She was screaming. Did you hear her?" "I heard her," Daryl said, stepping away from the window, trembling. There were cuts on the soles of his feet, blood dripping onto the floor. They didn't call the police. They didn't turn on the lights in the other rooms. They just stood in the dark, surrounded by broken glass, realizing that there was no longer any doubt. Imani was alive. She was here. And she had come for them. In the morning, they packed their belongings into 2 bags, a few clothes, documents, money. Daryl didn't bother to explain to his neighbors why they were leaving. They got into the car and drove out of the yard without looking back. Daryl knew a hotel on the outskirts of town, cheap, anonymous, where they didn't ask unnecessary questions. They rented a room on the first floor under a false name, paying in cash. The room was small and shabby. 2 narrow beds, a TV, a bathroom with cracked tiles. Janice sat down on the bed, dropping her bag on the floor. Her face was gray. "What are we going to do?" Daryl locked the door and drew the curtains. "I don't know, but we're safe here, at least for now." "We're not safe anywhere," Shani whispered. "She'll find us, no matter where we are. She won't stop until she kills us." Daryl didn't argue, because he knew she was right. The first few days at the hotel passed in heavy silence. Daryl and Shani hardly spoke, each lost in their own thoughts. The room felt like a cage, small, stuffy, smelling of mustiness and other people's lives. Daryl only went out for food and the bare necessities, looking over his shoulder every time. Shani didn't leave the room at all, spending her days at the window, peeking through the gap in the curtains. On the 3rd day, Daryl returned with a heavy bag. Shani looked at him questioningly. He took a gun out of the bag, an old .38 caliber revolver. He had bought it from an acquaintance from the past, a man who asked no questions and remembered no faces. "What for?" Shani asked, looking at the weapon with disgust. "For protection. If she comes, I won't let her kill us just like that." Shani hugged herself. "You want to kill her again? It worked so well the first time." Daryl placed the gun on the nightstand next to the bed. "Do we have a choice? We can run out of state, but she'll find us anywhere. She's proven that. Or we stay here and wait." "Wait for what? Death?" "Wait for a chance to defend ourselves." Shani sat down on the bed, covering her face with her hands. "We won't get out of this alive, do you understand? It's over." Daryl came over and sat down next to her, but didn't hug her. "Don't say that. We'll manage. We always have." But the words sounded hollow even to him. The days dragged on slowly. Daryl drank whiskey straight from the bottle, and Shani hardly ate. They slept fitfully, startling at every noise outside the door. The TV was on constantly, filling the silence with meaningless noise. They no longer discussed escape options. They both knew there was nowhere to run. Imani came on Thursday afternoon. Daryl went to the nearest store for food, bread, canned goods, water. Shani was left alone, lying on the bed and staring at the ceiling. She was almost asleep when there was a knock at the door. Quiet, polite. Shani raised her head, alert. Maybe the maid. She got up and went to the door. "Who is it?" "Housekeeping," came a woman's voice. Shani thought for a moment. They had hung a "Do Not Disturb" sign, but perhaps the staff hadn't noticed. She opened the door without removing the chain, and froze. Imani was standing in the doorway. She was thin, almost emaciated, wearing a dark jacket and jeans. Her hair was cut short, her face pale, but her features were the same as 10 years ago. On her chest, barely visible under the collar of her t-shirt, was a scar, uneven, pink, the mark of a bullet. Imani looked at Shani calmly, almost indifferently. In her hand she held a gun, pointed at the door. "Hi, Shani. Did you miss me?" Shani took a step back, but her voice caught in her throat. Imani pushed the door open, the chain snapping off. She stepped inside, closing the door behind her with her foot. Shani is back toward the bed, her hands shaking as she fumbled for the nightstand where Daryl's gun lay. But Imani was faster. She stepped forward, pointing the gun directly at Shania's face. "Don't move. Sit on the bed. Hands on your knees." Shanius obeyed, sinking to the edge of the bed. Her teeth were chattering, her breathing ragged. Imani walked over to the nightstand, picked up Daryl's revolver, and slipped it into her jacket pocket. Then she stepped back, leaving a few feet between them, and sat down on the edge of the second bed, still holding the gun. "You look scared," Imani said in an even voice. "That's good. You should be scared." "Imani," Shanis began, but her voice broke. Be quiet. First, I'll tell you a story. You listen. Then, maybe I'll let you have the last word." Shani bit her lip so hard that it bled. Imani began to speak. Her voice was calm, almost monotonous, as if she were recounting someone else's life. 10 years ago, my husband shot me in the chest. The bullet passed just above my heart, pierced my rib, and lodged in my lung. I lost consciousness almost immediately. The pain was so intense that my brain simply shut down. You threw me into a ravine. I don't remember the fall. I woke up at the bottom, in the dark, among rocks and mud. I don't know how much time passed. An hour, 2. I couldn't breathe. My lung was punctured. Blood was flooding my throat. I thought I was dying, but my body wanted to live. I started crawling, centimeter by centimeter. I stopped when I lost consciousness from the pain, then crawled again. I don't know how long it took me to get out, but soon I crawled onto the highway. A truck driver picked me up. He took me to a hospital in a neighboring state. I gave the doctors a false name. I said I had been attacked by robbers. I was afraid that if Daryl found out I was alive, he would come and finish me off. I was in the hospital for 2 months. Operations, infections, rehabilitation. I stayed in that city and decided not to go to the police. Then I worked wherever I could, as a waitress, a cleaner. I saved money. I regained my strength. I looked for information about you. I found out that you got married, that you opened pharmacies with my money, that you live happily, as if nothing had happened. I prepared for 10 years. I waited for 10 years. And now I'm here. Shani sat, unable to move. Tears streamed down her cheeks, but she didn't wipe them away. "Imani, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to." "Didn't mean to?" Imani smiled without smiling. "You stood by while he shot me. You helped him get rid of my body. You took my place, spent my money, slept in my bed. Don't tell me you didn't mean to." Shani sniffed, covering her face with her hands. Imani looked at her coldly, without pity. At that moment, the door opened. Daryl entered with a bag of groceries in his hands. He saw Imani and froze. The bag fell from his hands, cans rolling across the floor. His face turned ashen. "Imani." Imani turned the gun on him. "Hello, Daryl. Long time no see." Daryl slowly raised his hands. "Listen, we can talk. I can explain. Close the door. Slowly." Daryl obeyed, closing the door behind him, his eyes fixed on the gun. Imani nodded toward the bed next to Shani. "Sit down, hands on your knees like her." Daryl sat down, his hands shaking. Imani briefly repeated her story about the bullet, the 3 days in the ravine, the hospital, the years of recovery and planning. Daryl listened, his breathing becoming heavier. When she finished, he spoke, his words coming out hurriedly, desperately. "Imani, I didn't mean to. I swear. It was impulse. I was young, stupid. We needed money. I didn't think—" "You didn't think I was a person?" Imani interrupted. "You didn't think I had a right to live?" "No, I was wrong. Terribly wrong. If I could turn back time, I would change everything. Forgive me. Please." Shani was sobbing nearby, rocking back and forth. "Forgive us, Imani. We'll pay. We'll give you all the money back. Please don't kill us." Imani looked at them, the man she once loved and the woman who had taken her place. They sat before her, pathetic, broken, begging for mercy. 10 years ago, she had begged for mercy too, but they hadn't listened. She slowly stood up, raising the gun. There will be no forgiveness, only justice. Daryl jumped up, trying to reach for something in his pocket, but Imani was faster. She fired. The sound was deafening in the small room. But the bullet didn't hit Daryl. It hit Shani, right in the center of her chest, where her heart was beating. Shani fell back, her eyes wide with surprise and pain. She opened her mouth, but instead of words, only a rattle came out. Blood quickly spread across her white blouse. She fell onto the bed and didn't move. Daryl screamed and lunged at Imani, but she turned the gun on him. The first bullet hit him in the stomach. He doubled over, clutching the wound. The second bullet entered his chest. Daryl fell to his knees, then collapsed onto the floor next to the bed. His eyes stared blindly at the ceiling. Blood spread across the linoleum in a dark pool. Imani stood over the bodies, holding the gun down. She looked at Daryl and Shani, the two people who had stolen 10 years of her life. She expected to feel relief, triumph, satisfaction. But there was only emptiness. Revenge had been served, but the void inside her remained unfilled. She was still that wounded girl crawling at the bottom of the ravine. Imani turned away. Quickly, methodically, she began to erase the traces. She picked up the shell casings, wrapped them in a napkin, and put them in her pocket. She wiped the doorknob, the nightstand, everything she had touched. She checked to make sure there were no hairs or scraps of fabric left behind. When she was done, she took her sunglasses out of her pocket, put them on, and left the room, quietly closing the door behind her. She walked across this parking lot calmly, like a regular guest leaving the hotel. She got into her car, an old gray Toyota, bought with cash under someone else's name. She started the engine, drove onto the highway, and headed south, not exceeding the speed limit or attracting attention. The maid found the bodies only in the evening. She came to clean the room, knocked, got no answer, and opened it with her key. Her scream was heard throughout the hallway. An ambulance arrived, then the police. The officers cordoned off the crime scene and began questioning witnesses, but no one had seen anything. The surveillance cameras in the parking lot had not been working for several months. The hotel manager only remembered that the room had been rented by a middle-aged man who had paid in cash, but he did not remember his name. The investigation reached a dead end almost immediately. There were no witnesses, no leads, no motive. Robbery was ruled out. The money and valuables were untouched. Revenge? But who could hate Daryl and Shani Kincaid so much? A week later, the funeral took place. It was a double ceremony at a church on the outskirts of Birmingham. The coffins stood side by side, closed. The relatives had asked that the bodies not be shown, as it was too painful. About 40 people attended, friends, pharmacy employees, acquaintances. Everyone was dressed in black, their faces sad. Tyrone Ellerby stood by the wall, looking at the coffins in bewilderment. Next to him was Zola Mabry, holding a bouquet of white lilies. Tyrone shook his head and said quietly, "I can't believe it. Who could have done something so cruel? Daryl and Shani were good people. They built their business from scratch, never hurt anyone. They achieved everything on their own." Zola nodded, but her eyes showed doubt. "Yes, it's just strange that it happened exactly 10 years after Imani disappeared." Tyrone looked at her. "What do you mean?" Zola shrugged. "Nothing. Just a coincidence, probably." "Do you think it's related?" "I don't know. The police say it was most likely robbers, a random killing." Tyrone frowned but nodded. "You're probably right. The world has gone mad. People are being killed for no reason." They fell silent, staring at the coffins. At the other end of the church, by the window, stood Shani Kincaid. The old woman was not crying. Her face was impassive, her hands folded in prayer. She whispered the words of the psalm, but her eyes were dry. When the service ended and people began to disperse, Shani approached the coffins. She placed her hand on her son's coffin lid, stood there for a few seconds, then walked away. There was something like relief in her eyes. She had always known that sins come back, and now the circle was complete.